Now, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman with Juan Gonzalez. Our guest is one of the longest reigning FCC commissioners. He just retired last month. Michael Copps was a Democratic federal communications commissioner, served more than 10 years. I'm Amy Goodman with Juan Gonzalez. Juan?
Well, Commissioner Copps, you not only were a long-serving commissioner, but many reform advocates consider you perhaps the most progressive commissioner in the history of the agency, certainly dating back to the days of Nicholas Johnson, but probably in terms of your impact, even more so, specifically because of your efforts in the earlier part of the last decade to get the public directly involved in media policy. When Chairman Michael Powell, President Bush's first chairman, attempted to deregulate ownership rules, you took an extraordinary step of going out across the United States, holding informal public hearings to hear what the American people felt about their media system and how ownership should be regulated. Could you talk a little bit about your decision to do that and the impact that that had in getting citizens involved in media policy?
Well, it's interesting, Juan. When I first arrived at the FCC in 2001, and I think the then chairman was already considering loosening our media ownership rules so that fewer and fewer mega media companies could gobble up more and more independent, family-owned media outlets. And I think the majority probably thought this is pretty much of an inside the beltway game. Nobody is interested in numbers of outlets anybody can own outside the beltway, so we'll just do it here. And my colleague Jonathan Adelstein and I believed otherwise, and we took to the road, attended a lot of hearings. Probably in the years I was at the FCC, I went 75 or so hearings held by members of Congress, advocacy groups, consumer groups, a few by the Commission, not nearly enough. And back at that particular time that you reference, we just saw across the nation a tremendous amount of interest and an appreciation for the fact that something had been lost in media. A realization that all of this consolidation that we had been through had led to closing of newsrooms, firing of reporters. Right now we've got thousands and thousands of reporters who are walking the streets in search of a job, and they should be walking the beats in search of a story. The American people are not being properly informed. But anyhow, back to the point, after the first year of those hearings and all of these consumer and advocacy groups working so hard, more than 3 million Americans, more than 3 million contacted the FCC and the Congress, said, we don't want any part of these rules. Don't pass these rules. They'd already been rammed through the Commission, but because of this public reaction, the Senate voted to overturn them, the House voted against them, and then the Third Circuit Court in Philadelphia sent them back. But we're still diddling around with those rules here almost 10 years later. We haven't tightened the rules. We haven't done anything about media consolidation, and the situation gets worse, and the consolidation goes on and on. Some people say, oh, well, it's all over with. Not so. We had NBCU, Comcast earlier this year, Sinclair buying up a bunch of stations, Cumulus and Citadel, and I think when the economy turns a little bit, you're going to see a lot more of this consolidation, and every time you consolidate, you lose a local voice. You lose an element of localism. You lose coverage of a community's ethnic diversity and its cultural diversity, and it's bad for America.
Well, and specifically in terms of that ethnic or racial diversity, twice now the federal court in the district court in Philadelphia has overturned the deregulation of media ownership, specifically raising the fact that the FCC is not dealing with the question of the impact on racial minorities in the country, of increasing concentration of ownership in the media system, that we're increasingly becoming a racially diverse country, but one where the media still remain largely in the hands of the white population of the country. Could you address that?
Well, it's like the Commission on this issue is tone deaf. You're right, they have told us that, and yet we still haven't done anything substantive to right the wrongs and the injustice of minorities owning so few of our media outlets. We're a country now that's approximately 1/3 minority. People of color own around 3 or 3.5% of full-power commercial television stations in the United States of America. A little better, but not much, all single digits on radio, on female ownership. So why should we be surprised then with so few of these big companies owning all these outlets that we get this caricature of ethnic groups and the stereotypes and the lack of coverage of what these groups are contributing to America's society? We have got to take forthright, progressive steps to right this wrong. Owning a station has a lot to do with the kind of programming that's going to be on that station. Diversity of ownership and diversity of viewpoint, I think, go hand in hand. It's a tremendous problem, and the Commission has a long, long way to go to even begin to make a dent on it.
On the issue of regulation and monopolies, Commissioner Copps, you were the only commissioner to vote against the Universal Comcast merger. Explain the significance of what this merger is all about.
Well, it's just a question of too much power and too few, and this was a merger that was not only old media, but new media too, and the internet and broadband. And one thing we have to really be careful of in this country, we know what's happened as a result of consolidation in radio and television and cable. Now we have this awesome new technology of broadband and the internet. Are we going to allow it to go down that same road, denying its historical potential, and let it become the province of gatekeepers and controlled by a few? You know, I've spent 10 years at the Commission, and it's just every day one company comes in, we want to get bigger, and the majority, many times over the past years, they said, fine, they approved that. So then the competitor comes in and says, we got to get bigger, and it's just do this day after day after day, while consolidation continues and localism and diversity and competition suffer, and the American people suffer with it.
Commissioner, I want to ask you about the whole issue of journalism and the future of journalism. You've often expressed your concerns about this. The reality is that the advertiser-driven model of the old media, which basically sustained the salaries of reporters and newspapers and television stations, is fading away. The new media, there's lots of people working in new media, but they're not getting paid decent salaries to maintain families and buy homes. What should be the role of government in somehow or other assuring, and how could it assure, that local news is produced by people who work at these jobs on a full-time basis and can afford to maintain families doing that work?
Well, you put your finger on, I think, maybe the biggest problem that the country faces right now, and that's what's happened to media journalism. Most of the news that we get in the United States of America, 90 to 95% of it still comes from the newspaper newsroom and the broadcast television newsroom. It's not coming from blogs or the internet. There are wonderful, interesting, and innovative experiments out there, but this is the reality. The problem is there's so much less of that news because of the developments in the private sector that we talked about with consolidation, and because of the abdication of its public interest responsibilities by the FCC over the last 30 years, and not insisting on some public interest guidelines and enough news. I got so impassioned about this problem because I think the future of our self-government, the future of our democracy, hinges upon having an informed electorate. An electorate with sufficient depth and breadth of information that they can make sense out of all of the complex problems that we face and make intelligent decisions for the future of the country. And goodness knows, we face some of the most awesome challenges right now in terms of our economy coming back, our global competitiveness, being able to return, creating opportunity, health, you know, the whole list. But all of those issues are going to depend upon decisions made by the people, and those have to be fact-based, and you can't have a situation where we're saying, well, yeah, it's too bad what happened to newspapers and broadcasts, but the new media is going to fix that, because we don't have a model there for that. I guess maybe the first thing we need to do is just stop thinking about old media and new media and just think about we have a media environment right now in front of us. Part of it's traditional, but it's all one thing. This is how we inform ourselves. This is our information infrastructure. What are we going to do about it now? We can't sit around and wait. We can't watch journalism hemorrhage. We can't watch investigative journalism go down the tubes. So this has to become really a national priority. There are down payments. There are things we can do right now that the FCC could do tomorrow morning. For instance, in the world of broadcasting, you know, we used to have some guidelines, public interest guidelines, that we would look at when a broadcaster came in to renew his or her license every 3 years. Well, all of that's gone now. Beginning in 1980, we had 81, we had an FCC chairman who said, you know, television set is nothing but a toaster with pictures, and that's how they went on to conduct their public interest oversight. They got rid of all the public interest guidelines. The license period went from 3 to 8 years. Now you send in a postcard and basically no questions asked, you get it back. I'm not saying that having some public interest guidelines is going to solve our media problem, but it would be a down payment, and it would have immediate effects in broadcast. It would have some spillover effects in newspapers, because so many newspapers and broadcast stations are owned together. And it would get a dialogue going and confront this problem of what is the public interest on the internet. We have to have a discussion in the United States of America if we're going to move the town square of democracy to the internet and pave it with broadband bricks. How are we going to assure that it's accessible to all, open to all, that not only can you type something and send it into the ether, but that you're going to be heard, that you have some access to the conversation? That's public interest, and there is public interest consideration on what the future of the Internet's going to look like. There is a role, and we need to have a calm, cool, rational discussion about this very, very soon, or we're going to lose the opportunity, really, to craft a media future that's worthy of the country. This goes back in history. The builders of this country have always been interested in creating information infrastructure. George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, James Madison were presiding over this new experiment in democracy. And they knew that it hinged, this experiment, on an informed electorate. So they made sure, the writers of the First Amendment, they made sure that we had newspapers getting out to every American. They built post roads. They subsidized newspaper rates so that the news could get out. And that's the kind of challenge we have to look at now. Our challenge in this century is the very same thing. The technologies change, the names change, the small d democratic challenge remains the same. Make sure that electorate is informed if you wish to sustain self-government.
Commissioner Copps, I wanted to ask you about the Supreme Court hearing oral arguments on Tuesday, testing the constitutionality of a Bush-era regulation that allows the FCC to levy stiff fines on broadcasters for the use of vulgar language or nude images. The rule applies to radio and broadcast networks over the air, but not to cable TV. It all began in 1973 when Pacifica radio station WBAI aired an unedited version of comedian George Carlin's The 7 Dirty Words monologue. John Douglas, an active member of Morality in the Media, claimed he heard the broadcast while driving with his then 15-year-old son and complained to the FCC that the content was inappropriate for that time of day. I want to just play for a moment George Carlin reading the words that started it all.
There are 400,000 words in the English language, and there are 7 of them you can't say on television. What a ratio that is. 399,993 to 7. They must really be bad. They'd have to be outrageous to be separated from a group that large. All of you over here, you 7. Bad word. That's what they told us they were, remember? That's a bad word. No bad words, bad thoughts, bad intentions, and words. You know the 7, don't you, that you can't say on television? Huh? Those are the heavy 7. Those are the ones that'll infect your soul, curve your spine, and keep the country from winning the war.
Well, that was an edited version of the monologue by comedian George Carlin that aired on Pacifica radio station WBAI in 1973. In 1978, the Supreme Court ruled the FCC could punish WBAI for its broadcast, arguing words relating to sex or excretion when children might be listening were prohibited. Supreme Court Justices William Brennan and Thurgood Marshall dissented, noting the court's, quote, depressing inability to appreciate that in our land of cultural pluralism, there are many who think, act, and talk differently from the members of this court and who do not share their fragile sensibilities. Well, remarkably, almost 40 years later, the same issues are before a decidedly more conservative Supreme Court. And we said at the beginning of the broadcast, New York Times had an interesting piece quoting Justice Elena Kagan and others. It's saying the commission has said that swearing and Saving Private Ryan, the Steven Spielberg war movie, was not indecent, while swearing by blues masters and the music documentary by Scorsese was indecent. Nudity in Schindler's List, another Spielberg movie, was allowed, but a few seconds of partial nudity on NYPD Blue was not, leading Justice Elena Kagan to say the way this policy seems to work, it's like nobody can use dirty words or nudity except for Steven Spielberg. Michael Copps, your thoughts on this?
Well, I'll be a candid. I think you put your hands on a dilemma. We also have a national problem here. There are millions of people with families who have problems with some of the quality of the language on TV. There was an article in the Washington Post the other day that examples of profanity have gone up, I think, like 69 or 70% between 2005 and 2009, and that F word was bleeped, I think, was it 11 times in the first 2 weeks of 2005 and 276 times in the first 2 weeks of 2011. Let's begin with, we have a statute. When you become a commissioner at the Federal Communications Commission, you take a statute to enforce the law, and the law says you have to have a policy on indecency. The world has changed. There's no question about that. Values have changed. But there seems to be a lack of discipline. We used to have, when we had those public interest guidelines I talked about, we also had some broadcaster voluntary codes of conduct. And they kind of disciplined themselves. That's pretty much gone now, too. So you mentioned earlier on in the program, which I think is even worse in the language, some of the wanton and gratuitous violence that you see on TV. There's no reason for it. There's no legislation on that. There's no mandate for the commission to do anything. But maybe this is another one of those areas where we ought to figure out how we can enhance the level a little bit without coarsening it further. You can't have... I am not for having a rule where somebody is sitting watching programs and giving them a pass-fail. We've never had that. The commission only reacts when particular complaints come into it, and that's probably the better way to proceed. But I think if we picked out one or two of the really egregious examples, and there are, you wouldn't have to do much more than that, and the word would go out that it would be nice to have one avenue of our communications. And broadcast primetime shows are, of course, hugely important, not just on broadcast TV, but on cable and satellite and everywhere else. There is a difference between some of this and the Private Ryan, and it's kind of like, you know, when you see it, you know it, and you recognize it. So I think instead of getting us into warring camps, that what we really need to do is realize it's a problem for a lot of people, see if we can't work something out.
And Commissioner Fonda, I'd like to ask you, just in terms of your time on the FCC, any regrets in terms of what you were not able to accomplish during that time?
Well, I wish we could have done more in the media. I wish we could fix that licensing process so that we had some public interest guidelines. I would make them news-centric right now. If you're coming in for a license, what are you doing to enhance public news and public information so we can rebuild the journalism we had? So the votes that we had on media ownership, I wish there were 3 to 2 the other way, my way rather than the ways of the majority majorities that we had back at those time. And then the other decision would be to call telecommunications and regulate them like we always regulated plain old telephone service, instead of getting into this ridiculous semantical debate over, well, the internet isn't really telecommunications. So all of the consumer protections that advocates fought for generations on privacy and consumer protection and public safety and all that would apply to new communications too. If we're all going to the internet, why should we suddenly say, well, all of that stuff you want in plain old telephone service, that doesn't apply to the awesome new technologies of the internet? So those two things, I think, are the ones I would like to change.
Commissioner Copps, I want to thank you for being with us. Michael Copps is one of the longest reigning FCC commissioners. He retired after more than 10 years of service. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, the War and Peace